Well, to discuss today's rate rise, I'm joined in the studio by Sarah Hunter, an economist, a senior economist at KPMG. Sarah, thanks so much for coming in. It's no surprise why we're here with the rate rise, of course. And do you think the RBA has taken the right approach here?
Well, it's definitely the case that, obviously, you said inflation's running at a 21-year high, and even if we strip out some of the volatile components that come in from overseas, particularly fuel prices, other commodity prices, domestically we're seeing price pressures pretty much across the board. You have to look very hard to find a category that isn't rising pretty rapidly at the moment. So in that environment, it is right that we look to normalise interest rates. That's exactly what the RBA are doing, and it's a really rapid pace of normalisation. There's no doubt about that, but that's really what they're looking to do, is to dampen things down a bit, those domestic pressures, and ultimately get inflation back into that 2 to 3% band.
So we've got 1 in 3 people who have a mortgage in Australia at the moment. The rest have either paid it off or they're renting. Are we going to be finding that there's this middle bracket of Australia which are really doing the heavy lifting?
It's definitely obviously going to have an impact for those with a mortgage, particularly if you've got a variable rate mortgage. If you're fixed, you're in a slightly better position, at least in the near term. But actually rate rises feed through to more of the economy than that. So pretty much everyone will start to feel the impact one way or another. For instance, it feeds into housing construction, residential construction activity. We've got the data today. Building approvals are trending down. So eventually that'll get into the construction sector more broadly. And the housing market too. We know that prices are declining, but also activity levels. So this has an impact on real estate agents, conveyancers, movers, anyone who's associated with that particular sector. And they may or may not have a mortgage. So there's indirect spillovers as well as directly what happens to the mortgage interest rates.
I guess those spillovers will almost act as a derivative, that some of them may not be impacted immediately. There could be a lag.
Exactly. Yes, it takes time to feed through.
What's driving this inflation? Are we seeing that it's higher demand or a low supply of goods such as fuel and energy?
It's a bit of both. A typical economist answer, but it really is. Obviously, there is a supply component to all of this, particularly again around those commodity prices, the fallout from the conflict in Ukraine and how that's feeding through. But there is also a facet of strong demand globally, not just in Australia. Thinking about some of the manufactured products, for instance, we focus quite a lot on the supply chain disruptions, and they're there, absolutely. But actually, one of the things that's been driving those prices is the strength of demand and the recovery after COVID. So it is a bit of both, and it's more that demand and balancing demand and supply. That's what the RBA and other central banks are really trying to do right now with these rate rises.
On the issue of supply, if we're seeing supply being more susceptible here to the decision-making of the RBA, should we be seeing more fiscal policy at play? Because the government still has a few levers that it can pull to help manage the economy.
It's a really difficult question, and I think actually the Treasurer's statement last week sort of made that clear. On the one hand, there is a need, or a desire at least, to help support particularly those that are most vulnerable to the kind of cost of living pressures we're seeing. Those on lower incomes, they tend to have to spend more of their pay or their income on fuel and food and these other categories that are moving really quickly. But at the same time, we don't really want fiscal policy to be trying to stimulate the economy right now. We've got this strong demand story at play, and if we have extra fiscal stimulus, no matter what form that might take, it adds to that. So I think there's a bit of a balancing act that's going on here, and the Treasurer, I think, was signalling that in his statement. On the one hand, saying he does want to look at how he can help with cost of living pressures, but he's also signalling he doesn't want fiscal policy to be going in the opposite direction to monetary policy. So I think there's a reshuffling that we might see in the budget that tries to address both of those competing challenges.
Obviously, there's the government taking control or more involvement in the fuel excise by taking some or cushioning some of that blow to those people who are using fuel at the pump there. That's obviously set to end shortly. Should that be continuing in a way or in a bid to perhaps soften or cushion the impacts of these rising rates?
Well, it certainly would. If they left it in place, that would obviously mean that petrol stays at its current level and doesn't go back up by that 22 cents a litre. But I think this is part of that sort of broader discussion. I was just saying that it is a way of relieving some of these pressures, but it's quite a broad brush approach. Pretty much everybody that drives a car in Australia, over 90% in the latest census, balance, actually. So it's benefiting absolutely everybody from the highest income levels all the way down to the people on the lowest income levels. I suspect what we'll see is a more targeted approach. So perhaps not renewing that, but perhaps trying to do something else that's a bit more targeted to those that are most vulnerable, that are feeling the pressure the most right now.
If these rates continue to rise, and it's likely that they are going to, and wages still remain fairly stagnant or increasing shorter than inflation because they're beginning to increase ever so slightly, you would imagine that there'd be particular demographics that are really going to be stretched by this.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically what we see in terms of inflation's an average measure, right? It's an average of all the goods and services that people buy through the economy, but your individual rate will look a bit different. So what we normally see is people that are on lower income levels, and they're typically on lower wage levels as well, of course. They have to spend a higher proportion of their income on food, on fuel, on rent, and so they're more impacted by what's going on. There's also a really interesting geographic component to all of this as well, which is pretty hard for the government to tackle, but people in regional areas and in some of the cities outside of Sydney and Melbourne, rents in those parts of the country have moved really quickly, and they're also seeing a much higher pace of their own personal inflation, if you like. So these are the groups that are most vulnerable at the moment, that are feeling the squeeze the most. You can do something about some of that, perhaps not all of it, but you're right, it is different for different people, and that is what we're seeing playing out in the data.
Do you think that the government could be looking to be easing some of these pressures, perhaps when it comes budget time?
I think that is likely what we're going to see. It was a pretty strong signal for me, at least in the speech last week. As I said, the key thing is going to be how they balance that. So I expect if we do see some extra spending in one area, one type of support, we'll probably see some pulling back in another area, so that overall perhaps there's not much changing, because they don't want to do too much in terms of stimulating demand, but they do want to help those, I think, that are most at risk and are most vulnerable.
Difficult balance to strike. Sarah Hunter, Senior Economist at KPMG, thanks for your time.
Thank you.